From the foyer of the House of Commons this evening, we're joined by three members of Parliament. Conservative MP Ted Opitz served 33 years as a reservist in the Canadian military. Dan Harris is here for the official opposition, NDP. And Frank Valeriot is the Veterans Affairs critic for the Liberal Party. Good to see you all, gentlemen.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
Mr. Opitz, let me start with you if I can. Let's start with the timing of these announcements. Back-to-back days, the government rolls out money for mental health programs for soldiers and veterans. Just before tomorrow's Auditor General's report, which is expected to be critical of the government's handling of mental health services for vets. Talk to me about that timing.
Look, you know, we've talked to veterans all along. We've been working on these programs. We've got 14 points to improve the new Veterans Charter. That was based on a report from the Veterans Committee in June. And we've been working to address the concerns that the veterans have been telling us about all along. And we've arrived at that point. There's no point in holding these things up. We've always promised all along that we would move on it. We're moving on it, and that's what our government is doing. We do care about veterans. We want to make sure that our veterans get the care that they deserve, that they need, and that they are demanding from their government.
You're suggesting the timing is merely coincidental,
yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. Dan Harris, what's your response to that?
Well, I was actually very surprised to turn the television on early on a Sunday morning and see the minister up making that announcement to begin with. And of course, it's coming a couple of days before the Auditor General's report, which we expect to have some serious deficiencies in there. And then the minister, once again, during the announcement, actually had the gall to say that the $1.13 billion that was returned to the Treasury was being recycled. And I mean, this announcement over 5 years is still only equivalent to 1/6 of that money that they returned.
Okay, Mr. Valeriot, let me get you in on the conversation here. What's your reaction to the timing of these announcements?
Well, frankly, I'm not surprised at all. The minister had told most of us on the committee not to expect that money would be forthcoming. Now, all of a sudden, we find out $1.13 billion was lapsed. We hear from the parliamentary secretary that it went back to Treasury. We hear from the minister that it went back to programs. There's conflict there. So all of a sudden, we know the Auditor General's report is coming tomorrow. We have the largest constituency, the biggest base for Conservatives, who they relied on to vote Conservative, now telling everybody, telling the world they've lost trust, they've lost confidence in the Conservatives, and in the next election to vote anything but Conservative. So it's not a surprise that on the eve of the Auditor General's report, which will be an indictment, no doubt, of the Conservatives' lack of faithfulness to the sacred covenant we owe our veterans, that they would suddenly make this announcement of $200 million over 5 years. And let's not make a mistake here. The announcement of Rona Ambrose of $5 million, that's included in the 200. It's not additional.
Okay, Mr. Opitz, let's talk about that. The government announcing this money for funding for veterans just over the past 2 days here, and some people will wonder if that money will in fact be spent. What is the difference between the funding announced in the past 48 hours and this $1.13 billion over 7 years in unspent funds the Department of Veterans Affairs returned to the Treasury?
Well, let's understand that, and my colleagues know that, and I have no doubt that they do care about veterans, by the way. But these are based on estimates, and they're overestimated. So Veterans Affairs is a demand-driven process. So if 70,000 veterans show up for services, they will be funded. And if you've estimated for 100,000 rather, and 70,000 show up, they will be funded. So there's that delta of 30,000, and this is something that lapses over into the next budget year. However, if 70,000 and the first veterans show up to be funded, they will, asking for services, they will get those services. Veterans Affairs is fully funded. This is an estimate process, and my colleagues know how that works. It's rather cynical to infer that somehow this was not spent on veterans. That's not true. That's not correct. And in fact, it's unfortunately politicizing a parliamentary budgetary process that has been in place since 1867.
Okay, but I guess in terms of this funding, and that's the case I want you to make for veterans who may be watching, the government's case here is that, you know, what's the guarantee for them that the money that's been announced in the past 2 days will in fact go ahead, that it won't be lapsed?
Yeah, we're talking about the $200 million.
Right.
Yes. Well, that's new spending. That's money that's going towards OSI programs. It's over the next 6 years. These are very critical programs for our veterans suffering from PSD and operational stress injuries. They've talked to us over a long period of time. We've investigated this issue. We continue to investigate this issue. Mental health issues in the Canadian forces are not always entirely the same as in the civilian world, and also a lot of that funding is going to go for research to ensure that mental health issues in a military context are there. We're opening OSI offices across the country to directly interface with veterans. We're making sure that Veterans Affairs and the Department of National Defense are interfacing as well. So what that does is then it streamlines the process, it cuts red tape, it cuts the bureaucracy. Okay. And provides the services to the troops as they need it. Okay,
Mr. Harris, so because a lot of veterans have been wondering, okay, can we be sure this money that's being announced is actually going to be spent? You're getting that promise and guarantee from Mr. Opitz here tonight.
Well, I'm not sure with the track record whether I can believe it, but I certainly hope the money gets spent because the veterans need those services. And the cuts that have happened over the last several years have hurt veterans. And of course, you know, yes, there are estimates that are made, but what's happening time and time again is that veterans are being denied. They're having to go through appeals processes. They're having to take the government to court in order to get those services that they need and deserve and that they earned. And that's one of the reasons why the government was able to save money on that and to actually cut part of the deficit on the backs of veterans. And we're hearing it all across the country from veterans that are complaining and that are suffering from horrific injuries or post-traumatic stress. And it's absolutely not all right, and we need to fix that.
And Mr. Lariat? Go ahead.
Let me make 3 points, Peter. First of all, I asked that specific question in question period today, and the parliamentary secretary refused to answer. I said, will it lapse? He did not answer. So the door is completely open to allow it to lapse. Let's not kid ourselves. Secondly, the $1.13 billion was available to be spent on veterans and not go back automatically into Treasury. The Veterans Committee report of 14 recommendations this year in June, quite correct. But it's not the first time that veterans have asked for help. This has been going on for years, almost the same recommendations year after year after year. So why did they not spend the money? They could have spent the money. The third point here is that those veterans' offices that are closing, that were spoken of earlier, the services that were offered in those offices have not been replaced at Service Canada. There are people in Service Canada. They're not qualified, they're not trained, and people are being put. Corporal Fushko came before, a double amputee came before our committee and talked about the lack of service at Service Canada offices. He can't get through to these people. So let's not pretend that the closing of veterans' offices, the 9 offices, have been adequately replaced by putting people at Service Canada, because it has not.
Peter, if I can correct something, you know, in 2004-05, when the Liberals had their last full year, they lapsed $111 million. And with the closing of offices that were, by the way, either in the same building or just a few hundred meters away from Service Canada offices, we opened 600 different points of access to veterans. And I've had a lot of veterans come to me, especially from smaller locations, who said, thank you very much for putting it in these locations because I no longer have to travel to a larger center to get there, making it far more convenient. So they're not exactly telling the exact truth. And again, I reiterate that VAC is a demand-driven funding mechanism based on estimates. So it's not up to the minister to all of a sudden expand the amount of payments. It's driven by very professional VAC people that adjudicate the processes in the monies that are given out. And if they do not meet those estimates, then the money is not issued.
Okay, go ahead, Mr.
Peter, I was in Brandon, Manitoba, and I met with the veterans there. They now have to drive from Brandon all the way to Winnipeg. And there are veterans there that are of a vintage, for lack of a better word, that can't make the drive all the way to Winnipeg. It's over a 2-hour drive. And so you know what's happening? They're not getting the services, or they're having to call in and be put on hold on a 1-800 number that's given to them. And I asked the minister, if you're going to give them a phone number, at least answer the phone when they call. And then they say, well, they have access to computer services. Well, you can't get proper servicing from human resources that you need one-on-one contact with over a computer, especially older veterans who are not versed in the use of computers. It is an exaggeration to suggest that people are happy about the closing of these offices.
I disagree.
All right, Mr. Harris, you want to jump in there?
Well, I mean, it's cuts and money lapsed on both sides, but over the last 8 years, this government had an opportunity to actually fix the problems that were there before, and they haven't done that. And the closing of the veteran centres and now putting them on to Service Canada, those men and women have done their time on the line. They shouldn't have to wait in a line. They shouldn't have to wait on hold to get the services that they earned and deserve.
Okay,
if I can, just,
okay, I'll give you a quick final word, Mr. Opitz. Then
over the period we were in government, we spent over $30 billion since 2006, $5 billion more than the Liberals ever spent on veterans. And when I joined the military in 1978, I remember the times of the Liberals. We had nothing. It was this government that made sure that our military had the equipment and the clothing and the protective gear to protect our soldiers in the field. They sold us.
So that justifies treating them the way you do now?
Nonsense.
All right, gentlemen, that's our time for tonight. I think we'll be able to follow up on this tomorrow, I'm sure, when we get the Auditor General's report, and that'll give us a little more detail on what may or may not be working when it comes to veterans and the services they get from government. Thank you all tonight.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.